In this course, we'll be learning about the foundational knowledge needed to understand IP version 6. In this video, we're going to cover the contents of this IP version 6 course. One thing to understand is when we're upgrading from IP version 4 to IP version 6, we're actually upgrading a few different aspects. Number 1, the addresses. Number 2, the packets. And number 3, the protocols. When it comes to the addresses, we're dealing with much larger addresses and different ranges, and multicasting looks a little different. There are some upgrades when it comes to the addresses, and we'll be discussing those. We'll also get into the packets, the actual packets that are going back and forth between devices. The structure of that has changed, and we'll talk about that as well. And then the protocols, the steps of communication have changed as well. So we'll get into the protocol changes. So overall, what we're going to do is we're going to start out with talking about those IP version 6 addresses. We'll get into the packets and routing and what it looks like. We'll get into some specific protocols that are needed for IP version 6, like neighbor discovery protocol is a huge component when it comes to IP version 6. We'll get into how addresses get assigned with IP version 6, and then we'll also talk about IP version 6 subnetting. When it comes to IP version 6 addresses, we're going to talk about the format of IP version 6 addresses. There are some significant differences between IP version 4 and IP version 6. And we'll get into different address types. For instance, we've done away with a broadcast, and we have a multicast address that does something kind of similar in IP version 6. We've also introduced something called an anycast. And since IP version 6 addresses can get quite large, there's a way we can condense these addresses. But of course, we'll also need to know how to expand them. And we'll get into different IP version 6 address ranges and what they're used for. Multicast plays a huge part in IP version 6, so we'll get into things like solicited node multicast. Then we'll get more in depth into packets and routing. We'll take a look at what an IP version 6 header looks like, and what are some of the differences between IP version 4 and IP version 6 when it comes to the header and the packet. And how we're not going to be able to just cut everything over to IP version 6, but we have this transition period, and what that transition period from IP version 4 to IP version 6 looks like, and some protocols that we put into place to help facilitate this. Then we're going to get into Neighbor Discovery Protocol, NDP. NDP is a critical part of IP version 6 and how it operates. We'll take a look at different ICMP types. Specifically, we're going to take an in-depth look into router solicitations, router advertisements, neighbor solicitations, and neighbor advertisements, and how these take the place of things like ARP and DHCP. And we'll take a look at how the actual packets are formed when going across our network and this communication happens. We're going to take a look at that from both the logical perspective on a map like this, as well as take a look at the actual packets that we see within Wireshark. Then we'll get into assigning IP version 6 addresses. There's a few different ways that we can actually set our machines up with IP version 6 addresses. So we'll take a look at what those options are. And those options are that we could statically assign those. We could use a stateful DHCP version 6 server. We can use Slack, or we can use Slack with a stateless DHCP server. And we'll explain the differences with each one of those. And then we'll get more in depth into assigning static. In fact, I'll do a demo on assigning static addresses to both Linux and Windows machines. And we'll also get into what some of those Slack messages look like and how they're messaged back and forth between the router and the client machine. And then we'll talk about IP version 6 subnetting. And here's just a hint, it's much easier than IP version 4. And there's a couple ways we can do this subnetting, whether we want to have just the basic, just count up, or if we want to get a little more elaborate and have a more advanced way of assigning IP addresses. And in some ways, assigning it in more of an advanced way actually can simplify things, and we'll get into that. We have quite a bit of ground to cover when it comes to IP version 6, and there's significant differences between IP version 4 and IP version 6. I've also found that there's some confusing information out there when it comes to Neighbor Discovery Protocol. But what we're going to do is we're going to stair-step our way through this information, and it's going to build on itself. So make sure you start at the beginning and work your way through the material to learn the most about each step of the way. And that way, by the time we get to Neighbor Discovery Protocol, it'll be easy to pick up. I look forward to covering this information with you, so let's get started.